There are a few main ways that the story of Bioshock is told to the player. The first is in cutscenes, cinematics where the player has no control over their character. The game begins and ends with one, and there are a few scattered throughout, but they are by far the rarest form of narrative content. The reason for this comes back to the initial design of the game, wherein player control and choice are the most important features. Cutscenes are the opposite of this, taking control away and forcing the player to sit back and do nothing. Another big drive of this is the Half-Life series, two of the most acclaimed first-person shooters of all time, and neither had cutscenes, instead allowing the player to walk around and interact with the environment while the story took place. First-person games are some of the most immersive experiences, as the player is literally in the protagonist's head. They see the same things and experience them in the same way. If a different camera perspective happens, such as for vehicle sections, or to showcase an event happening elsewhere, it disrupts this. Bioshock and Half-Life both fall into the category of immersive sims, attempting to plant the player in a world and keep them there, fully engaged and caring about what happens. To that end, maintaining control is crucial to keeping this level sustained. Bioshock is a game focused on story, so it needs to tell that in other ways. One is the radio the player is given the moment they receive control. Through it, they're able to communicate with Atlas, their ally for much of the game. It is, however, a one-way street, as the player character never speaks. Silent protagonists are certainly not an unusual occurrence in gaming, Link and Gordon Freeman being the most famous. In some ways, it allows the player to interject their own thoughts and feelings without being told what their character thinks. In others, it reduces the protagonist to a blank slate, more of an observer than an active actor. Bioshock does offer a narrative reason for the main character's silence, which is more than most games. Though Jack, the protagonist, narrates the opening, it is effectively a lie to the player, the first of many. Once he arrives in Rapture, however, he is a man with a singular purpose. There's no discussion about it, because he has no choice. Once things are set into motion, he's just following orders, thus there's no room for speaking, for discussing, or debating. There's just the mission. In many ways, this represents the player's inherent desire to follow orders, to ignore all story elements and get to the good stuff. I am Jack's brain, and I want endorphins. There are a number of segments where the player will walk around while someone talks to them on the radio, be it Atlas, Andrew Ryan, or others. This is meant to give the player the opportunity to explore the environments and take a break from the action. These aren't the only times the player will be talked at, though, as there are a number of audio diaries scattered around the world. These are large devices containing a small bit of dialogue from characters. These are almost always intentional, that is, the person deliberately recorded them, rather than an external device listening in. Audio logs became one of the hot items after this, as the default way to tell a story. Bioshock is far from the progenitor in games for this, but it was certainly the codifier of it. After its release, the floodgates opened, and games like Halo 3 ODST, Dead Space, Mass Effect, and Borderlands all feature them in some capacity or another. In many ways, it is cheap. It disregards the common writing principle of show, don't tell. However, there are reasons it works better in games than in other media. Flashbacks in games are significantly less effective than in other mediums. Part of this is as described before, the loss of control. It's literally ripping the player out of the current time period and putting them in another. While this can be disruptive in film or TV series, it's amplified when a player is involved with the situation, be it controlling the character. All the games listed put the player in the role of a singular character, and as such, if there's a flashback, who would they play as? Would they just be an omniscient observer? Take on the role of a random character in the scene? Be themselves, but as a ghost? None of these quite work, and so another solution was required. Thus, logs, where a character describes what happens. In Bioshock, almost all of these are short snippets of dialogue, generally under 1 minute. There are 122 of these throughout the game, and they can be divided into a few categories. 44 of them cover the backstory of Rapture, all the events leading up to the start of the game. These include finding the sea slugs that would eventually be turned into Adam, the construction of the city, and the war between Frank Fontaine and Andrew Ryan. 26 of them cover the backstories of the main characters seen in the game, including Bridget Tenenbaum, J.S. Steinman, and Sander Cohen. 21 of them are personal stories from miscellaneous citizens of Rapture, depicting the good times and the bad ones. Another 15 offer hints or quest objectives for the player. 11 of them describe Ryan's political ideals and what Rapture was founded to represent, and the final 5 offer hints about the player character's backstory. They're spread fairly evenly throughout the game, though some of them are more off the beaten path than others. 5 of them offer codes that open numerical locks. These locks can also be hacked, but the guides offer a free or easier way to open them. One log in particular simply says the combination is Australia Day, which as we all know is the 16th of January, although the date is also available on a calendar and poster nearby. These diaries are almost all well voice acted, and it's clear a great amount of attention was put into the sound mixing to ensure they really felt like recordings from the era. While very few are standouts, there are a few that stick with the player. The ones that have the most impact are those with action happening during it. The first audio diary a player finds has the fall of Rapture going on in the background, and one much more towards the end of the game as the player hear what happens if one injures a little sister with a Big Daddy nearby. In addition to the audio diaries, there's a fair amount of environmental storytelling. Bloody letters stripped from walls, and corpses lie sprawled, holding on to what was most important to them in life, money and alcohol. There's also occasional dialogue from splicers. The player runs across a couple arguing, or a group of normal ones attacking a member of a renegade cult. In many of these cases, the player is not required or even incentivized to kill them. In Cinder Cohen's apartment, there are a dancing couple who will not attack the player at all. While most of the enemies in the game will rush blindly to violence, there are a few that are meant to be observed. Finally, there are ghosts. Due to corruption from plasmids, the player is able to see ghosts in certain areas. These are one-and-done events, wherein after walking into a certain area, transparent figures appear, say a line or two of dialogue, and then disappear. During this time, static fills the screen, and the player is unable to do anything but walk slowly. A very similar type of event occurred in System Shock 2. Not all of these ghosts are haunted by bad memories, some of them are good, and really it's just another way of giving backstory to the player. It feels out of place in some ways. All the information could be presented the same in an audio diary, but without the disruption. Neptune's Bounty is the next major area of the game. It was formerly a wharf and a shipping hub. It was also the home of Fontaine Fisheries, which was the base for the biggest smuggling operation in the city. Fontaine was the other major power, besides Ryan, and the one who had first discovered and utilized Adam. After Fontaine was killed, the whole area fell into disrepair. However, Peach Wilkins, a former dock worker, barricaded himself in with a large amount of supplies, and bided his time until the war was over. The player is tasked with passing through the hideout to get to Smuggler's Bay. After exploring the dock area, fighting off a fair amount of splicers, automated turrets, and potentially a new variation of a Big Daddy, the player will find themselves talking to Peachy. He's afraid of spider splicers, a new variety of enemy that crawl around ceilings, as well as throwing hooks as projectiles. To that end, he tasks the player with finding a research camera and using it to take pictures of 3 of the creatures. Exploring the bounty offers more opportunities to learn the backstory of Rapture, as well as fully engage with the combat systems. The player has most of the weapons they'll acquire, including a new grenade launcher, and there are several roaming Big Daddies that can offer opportunities to use hacking, traps, and other splicers to help bring them down. The player is also given the Hypnotized Security Plasmid, again encouraging the use of the environment to their advantage. The Medical Pavilion explored the bloody consequences of no restrictions. It played very much in the body horror genre, with disfigurements and a mad doctor at the forefront. Inspirations from Hostel or Human Centipede, where infinite possibilities combined with madness resulted in Steinman. Neptune's Bounty instead opts for less gore and more grime. Instead of white hallways, there's warped wood, with fish flopping around and water draining freely. The stories here are much more about class struggles, the contrast between the utopia that was promised by Ryan and the reality that someone needs to clean the shit. There are no jump scares, and much more focus is placed on the world building rather than horror. There's definitely a departure in tone from the previous area, and this continues into Arcadia. While both of these offer their own take on the Fallen Paradise, there's a significant disconnect in how they feel, and as such this section of the game feels like a bit of a slump. Whenever there is discussion about Bioshock, it will inevitably be about the beginning, Fort Frolic, or the twist, and the middle areas are left by the wayside. The same can be said of minigames though, and after all, it makes sense to put the most attention in something that will be seen by every player of the game, and to leave it off with a bang, so this sophomore downturn is understandable, but makes this area of the game slower than it may have otherwise been. After the player finds the camera, they then explore a few areas including a mailroom and a bar, taking pictures along the way. The way the camera works is that it is a weapon, the same as any other in the equip wheel. After selecting it and taking a snapshot, it's graded just like Pokemon Snap. Make sure it's right in the middle of the frame. This fills up a research bar, which then gives a bonus of some kind. Most of them are simple damage buffs, but there are additional perks, including the gruesome bonus of being able to use Spider Splicer hearts as first aid kits. Unfortunately, the mechanics for this are a little bit clunky, as swapping between the camera for every single enemy is the best way to play, but it's also very tedious. Pictures taken of corpses do give a little research, but nothing compared to one of a live foe. The gameplay of this was improved in the sequel, which has the player taking a picture of a foe, then it automatically swaps to a new gun, and the more damage a player does to the enemy in a short time, the more research they get. After bringing the photos back to Wilkins, he invites them into his frozen abode. First, however, they're forced to leave their weapons in a tube, though still keeping a wrench and plasmids. After entering the next area, fog descends, and they're attacked by Wilkins, who is sure the player is either working for the ghost of Fontaine or Andrew Ryan, and either way they need to die. A short fight later, and the player is allowed to progress, picking up their weapons from a nearby tube. Interestingly, even if a player has not collected any of the weapons so far, they'll acquire them here. The player can then progress to Smuggler's Hideout, where Atlas's family is hiding out. After a short walk, they reach the submarine and pull a lever to help free it. Unfortunately, Ryan had planned for this and blows up the submarine. The player then has to fight their way free, although it's not a long level. All of this seeks to give the player a reason to want to kill Ryan, but ultimately it doesn't feel very successful. The player has been told over and over again how the city failing is Ryan's fault, and has heard personal horror tales via the audio diaries. There's no need to ramp it up by killing someone the player cares about or is supposed to. Next, the player heads to Arcadia, a botanical sanctum. It was an oasis for those who lived in Rapture, a forest under the sea, but it also provided oxygen that filtered throughout the rest of the city. Here the player starts to find objects like rubber tubes and batteries in containers, as crafting is introduced. This is the last major mechanic, and as such it could be said the tutorial sections are done, and this is the first complete level. It also introduces the Houdini splicers, who can teleport and throw fire. The themes of this level are obvious, and directly stated in one of the audio diaries. The park was free for a while, but Ryan demanded they charge for it, part of his grand plan for capitalism. And so when he gets directly involved, all the trees die, and the once prosperous area falls into disrepair. Part of the goal of this level is to show that even after the fall of Rapture, there is still beauty around. Not just the trees, but roses, and even a once thriving market. By restoring the trees, it shows that no destruction is permanent, and there's still potential for good. As the player is all set to leave and head directly to Ryan, the area is shut down, and poison is pumped into the atmosphere, killing all the trees. Julie Langford is introduced, a scientist who helped create the park and has the ability to save it. She invites the player to come see her, but is unfortunately murdered by Andrew Ryan. The player is then given a fetch quest: go find bee poop, water down wine, and some magic potions. The potions, or chlorophyll solutions, can be found on the corpses of the Saturnine, a cult dedicated to the old gods. Not a huge amount is done with them, but the player can find a few of their hideouts, and they sometimes fight with non-cult splicers, but it's a footnote rather than the main feature of the level. After acquiring the miscellaneous items needed to save the trees, the player heads back to Langford's office, and begins to prepare the Lazarus Vector, the antidote that will save the trees. It takes approximately 30 splicer deaths long to complete, although the player is given assistance in the form of Big Daddy and some turrets. After that is done, they can restore greenery to the level and move on. Overall, this section of the game is very much about biding time, building up the player's arsenal and variety of skills, as well as enhancing the lore of Rapture. There are no big revelations or even hugely memorable moments. There's still some scripted encounters and moments that are enjoyable or offer interesting insights, but compared to the incredible beginnings of the game, it is a bit of a letdown. A Big Daddy with a little sister is the most iconic image from Bioshock. It's the cover image for the game on just about every promotional image, and was the foundation of the game before there was one, with the 3-part dynamic to discuss before. Then there was the highest accolade of all, a roster slot in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, joining the prestigious cast including Fat Princess, and featuring Remake Dante from Devil May Cry. A random Big Daddy was finally given the attention he deserved. Of course, Bioshock may have come out 3 months later and ran worse on the PlayStation 3, but that was of no concern when it came to representing Sony in all its glory. But what made the Big Daddy so iconic that they were given this prestigious role? There are a few things that gave it this fame. The most obvious is the design. Diving suits had been used since the early 18th century. The first were effectively just a jumpsuit with a metal bowl on top. Later they evolved to add more protection, and around the early 1900s, the design was codified into what people think of today. The large spherical head with clomping boots and additional instruments around the neck and back. There are a few things around the design that evoke fear. The first is that it's faceless. Despite being humanoid by design, it's missing the identifying features, which provokes a natural aversion. The second is the size of them. Though it's designed to house a person snugly, the extra features require it to be bulkier and to tower over others around it. This is especially true in atmospheric diving suits, which are made for more extreme conditions, and were the primary inspirations for the Big Daddy. A number of robotic monsters from early serials evoke the same design sensibilities. Despite this, very few films, and especially horror films, have taken advantage of the image. Of course, we can look to Scooby-Doo. In the second episode of its first season, there was the ghost of Captain Curtis. Although this was iconic, also featuring in the recent, 20 years ago, live-action adaptation sequel, Scooby-Doo 2: Monsters Unleashed, calling that film an underrated gem is far too high praise, but it's a decent romp that certainly deserves a watch for anyone who's a fan of the Scoob. Aside from that, we can look to 1989, the year of aquatic horror movies. Deep Star 6, Leviathan, The Abyss, Lords of the Deep, and more. Though all of these films feature underwater bases and characters in suits, none of them have them as a villain. It's effectively an untapped niche, and aside from difficulties shooting underwater, it seems like there's no real reason. The closest thing is surprisingly enough James Bond, which in For Your Eyes Only features a villain in a diving suit. Another large part of the effect of the Big Daddy is the audio. When there is one around, the player knows. There's a deep breathing, distinctive and separate from all other noise. Every step they make is an echoing stomp, giving even their very presence a huge weight. When attacked, they let off a battle cry, including a screen-shaking effect. Each of their attacks is given weight, with meaty sound effects, and their iconic shoulder charge again having a screen shake. When they crash into a player, there's an equally strong crunch, and even their dying breath is a mournful gasp, inspired by a wail. There's also the role of the Big Daddy in the game. They're one of very few enemies that are not directly adversarial, at least not if unprovoked. They wander around with their little sister, protecting her, well, sort of. Unfortunately, some of this dynamic has been lost, and splicers will not attack Big Daddies during normal gameplay. It's possible to lure them into conflict. Using the Big Daddy as cover can result in them attacking foes that shot them, but on their own, the splicers will not try to attack them to get the little sister. It's unfortunate this was lost, as it would have helped cement the story the game is trying to tell. As it stands, most of the time there's no interaction between them. In most combats is either the player versus a Big Daddy, or the player versus splicers. The hypnotized plasmids can change this, allowing the use of one against the other, but it's not the natural dynamic, it's the player interfering. In the lore, Big Daddies were originally just workers, and tasked with repairing the various elements of Rapture. The suits were to allow them to make modifications both inside and outside the city. These were initially voluntary positions, with highly skilled workers as the pilots. Gradually this was twisted, as with the discovery of Adam, things changed. Now there was another need for them, as guardians for the little sisters that were incubators of the substance. Thus the protective program was born. Now prisoners, the criminally insane, and other undesirables were conscripted to become Big Daddies. Injected with plasmids and surgically sewn into suits, they become unwilling participants in the war for the city. Combat with Big Daddies is the part of the game that can utilize the resources the player has at their disposal best, but it's also potentially the most broken. In terms of options, the player has weapons available like proximity mines, electric tripwires, and hacked turrets. Big Daddies have a large amount of health, so setting these up can often be necessary. They're also a good opportunity to use alternate ammo, like armor-piercing bullets or electric shells. These are in low supply, so a player is encouraged to save them for when they really matter. And by having these mini-bosses, it helps avoid the typical save the potions for later problem. When the encounter happens, it's also almost always up to the player, as the Big Daddies passively walk around until attacked. This means there is time for setup and planning. There are two types of Big Daddies, Bouncers and Rosies. Bouncers are the first encountered, and the archetypal image of the Big Daddy. They have a single drill as their only weapon, and are strictly melee focused. They have the most health, and have a charge move, allowing them to cross distances quickly. The Rosies, on the other hand, have a rivet tool that has been adapted into a weapon, as well as the seemingly infinite supply of proximity mines. They're encountered in Neptune's Bounty, and are significantly more difficult to defeat, as their weapon will bring the player down in a few shots. More advanced variations of both show up later in the game, with more health and dealing additional damage. There are strategies to defeat both, however, excluding preparation. One is the killbot strategy. A player can respawn an infinite amount of times in a Vita chamber, but the enemy's health does not reset between revives. This means that with enough resistance and time, a player can bash their head against them until they're dead. Inefficient, but it does get the job done. This strategy can be used against every enemy in the game, except the final boss, but is one of the less exploitative methods. There's also an option, added after initial release, to turn off Vital Chambers that allow for this, and return to a traditional save system. The Big Daddies, as well as all mechanical enemies, are particularly vulnerable to electric attacks. By switching between weapons and plasmids, it's very possible for a player to stunlock them, killing them before they have the chance to fight back. While this does require potentially rare resources like electric buck ammo for the shotgun, it can also be purchased from certain vending machines, and killing a Big Daddy nets the player a large amount of cash. It doesn't really make sense why the diving suit monster men are so flush with it, at least in terms of the world. But in terms of gameplay, it helps the player recoup the high ammo cost needed to bring them down. The monetary rewards are not the true reason a player would fight a Big Daddy though, as that's nothing compared to the little sister and the Atom. After a player kills the Big Daddy, they are offered two options: to kill the little sister or rescue her with a plasmid given by Dr. Tenenbaum early in the story. Killing them gives the most Atom, though shown by this chart, it's not by a lot. This is because for every 3 little sisters saved, the game provides a gift offering a chunk of Atom, plasmids, and ammunition. Killing even a single little sister also gives the player the bad ending, with slight differences depending on the number killed. Both of these were due to influence from 2K, the publisher. They insisted they wouldn't ship a game where the player was punished for doing the right thing, as well as asking for multiple endings to help cement the binary good versus evil of the decision. Little sisters are the harvester in the 3-part dynamic, and they evolved significantly from the initial depiction. Inspiration came from research into stem cells and the moral issues that go around it. This eventually developed into Atom, precious material that could be harvested from sea slugs that dotted the ocean's floor. Unfortunately, the slugs provided very little, but it was discovered that if it was implanted in a human host, the result was dozens of times more efficient. The first designs from Irrational were a slug-like creature. Some were more humanoid, where others resembled a worm. The problem was the team wanted the player to care about these, as they wanted the moral decision to kill them or save them to affect the player. They began to make them more sad-looking. One design was a dog in a wheelchair, but none of them were fully realized. The big goal was to get the player to want to save them, so the team asked what would make players think protection the most, and so the concept of a little girl as the gatherer came up. After some initial back and forth, this became the idea the team focused on, and of course, what was in the final game. Initially, they were as vulnerable to weapon fire and plasmids as any other character, but this resulted in them being killed in the crossfire too much of the time, as well as the murdering children controversy. To that end, as well as concerns from the publisher, the story team was forced to come up with a solution. They decided that as a side effect of injecting the sea slug, it also made them effectively immortal, regenerating damage and allowing them to breathe underwater. They could still be killed, however, by removing the slug that gave them this power. John Paul LeBreton, a level designer, expressed frustration over this, calling their Immortality a massive kludge on the fiction. As Atom became widespread, shortages began to emerge, and the Little Sisters were co-opted into another role. Instead of just incubating Atom, they would wander the streets with their protective Big Daddy, harvesting atoms from corpses. Thus they finally reached their part in the initial 3-part dynamic. Bioshock was more than just another game. People looked to it as an icon, something that proved that video games could be more than entertainment or children's playthings. There was a desire to have games accepted as an art form. It's easy to see why. People devote not only their free time, but their lives and their careers to the medium, and to have people who don't play games dismiss it is a hard thing to accept. Whenever this debate comes up, it's hard not to look at Roger Ebert's comments on the subject. Ebert is cited as one of the greatest film critics of all time, largely because his taste was that of the everyman. While he could enjoy big dramatic productions, he could also enjoy a blockbuster. In terms of games, however, he was dismissive. To my knowledge, no one in or out of the field has ever been able to decide a game worthy of comparison with the great dramaticists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers. Did he imagine games as Pac-Man or Pong? Maybe. It's hard to say exactly what he had played or seen when the discussion took place. That was in response to the review of the Doom movie. An awful film by all accounts, though some claim that you just didn't get it if you hadn't played the game. He later doubled down on this attitude, claiming that for most gamers, video games represent a loss of those precious hours that we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic. Some would say that it wasn't his fault, that he simply had a high bar for what art was, as he had been quoted as saying, "Hardly any movies are art." A fair criticism if he had been versed on both mediums. In his final article on the subject, responding to a TED Talk by developer Keely Santiago, he says that it will be generations before games can be art, if they ever get there. He also dismisses the examples she gives as a brainless shooting gallery, prose on the level of a wordy fortune cookie, and decorative interest on the level of a greeting card. Through these examples, we can see Mr. Everett wasn't interested in discussing themes or potentials, and he was so sure the games weren't art that it didn't even bear consideration. In his closing statements, he comments on the desperate need for gamers to have him tell them what is art, for the critic to tell them what they're doing is important and that it matters. He offers his blessing that games are art, if it makes them happy. Despite the tone, he is correct, and the general audience was looking for validation in all the wrong places. To prove to someone that doesn't play games they are art is a fool's errand. Accolades, graphics, story, none of this means anything, as they will always say it's not enough. In some ways, that's right. Game stories and dialogue are still very much in its infancy, as is the industry itself. What could be considered modern game development is only 40 years old. And even then, a team of 10 in a basement doesn't compare to the international teams of thousands that make up AAA development today. Even the most basic story, with adequate writing, is lauded as the new gold standard simply because it's not bad, but ultimately it doesn't matter, because they don't matter. Games are art, and those involved with them know it. High art, low art, a masterpiece, these are all meaningless in the grand scheme of things, and arguing about them only serves to waste breath. This may seem tangential, but it's crucial to why the reception of Bioshock was the way it was. On one level, it was a guy with a gun running around and shooting people, but it was also in this amazing undersea world, with actual inspirations like Art Deco. That period also happened to be the start of the first modern films, talkies, and what they represented was art, but it was more than just the looks. This was a game about something grand, or at the very least more than just Peach getting kidnapped. There are philosophical themes, big names like Ayn Rand and objectivism. All this fancy talk bled through, not only to the audience at the time, an audience who so desperately wanted something to show off, but also to the team. When they received negative feedback from playtest groups, the initial reaction was they didn't get it. Perhaps these people lacked the education to catch the game's highbrow references. They were making a smart game for smart people, and anyone who didn't realize it was just clearly in the wrong. Some of this definitely stems from the man at the top, Ken Levine. He was the director and head of the company. He was Bioshock's Andrew Ryan, for good and for ill. As shown in even the earliest concept documents, there was the idea that Bioshock was going to be something special, that it would blow away expectations and deliver something never seen before. Levine not only aimed high, but demanded that everyone on the team have the same expectations. This is definitely part of why the game turned out as it did, but it's easy now, looking back, to see the cracks, but more interesting to see why they appeared. The full story of development will come another day, though, as we explore the depths of Levine's madness, the twists that you've all been waiting for, and what exactly the term ludonarrative dissonance means. Would you kindly like, subscribe, and take a look at my Patreon?